There is a particular kind of woman I have met many times. She is warm. She is considerate. She is easy to be around. And she has spent the better part of her life making herself a little smaller than she actually is, in rooms, in conversations, in her own marriage, not because she was forced to, but because somewhere along the way she learned that smaller was safer, that smaller was polite, that a woman who takes up too much space, who has opinions, who speaks without softening, who does not apologize for existing, makes people uncomfortable. I want to talk today about what it costs to live that way and about what happens when a woman finally stops. I am going to tell you about Carol. She is 64. She was widowed 5 years ago after 31 years of marriage. Her husband was not a cruel man. He was opinionated and certain, and he liked things a particular way. And over 30 years, Carol had quietly, without entirely realizing it, built her life around not disrupting that. She laughed at the right moments. She steered conversations away from things that would create friction. She swallowed opinions she held strongly, because expressing them would cost more than keeping them to herself. She was not miserable. She was not trapped. She loved her husband. But she had become, by the time he died, someone who was very hard to know because she had spent 3 decades making herself difficult to see. And then he died, and then 5 years passed, and one evening she was at dinner with her daughter and her daughter's husband, and her daughter said something Carol disagreed with sharply. And Carol started to say so, and then stopped herself the way she always had, and then thought, why am I doing that? He is not here anymore. There is nobody to manage. So who exactly am I doing this for? That question changed something. The first thing I want to say is about how this happens, because it does not happen all at once, and it is almost never dramatic. Nobody tells a woman to make herself smaller. What happens instead is a long series of small lessons, a child who learns that her excitement is too loud, a teenager whose strong opinion is called bossy, a young woman who sees that the women around her who are certain and direct are described in ways that are not quite compliments, a wife who notices that peace is easier to maintain when she adapts. None of these lessons comes with a warning. None of them says you are being taught to disappear. They feel instead like good sense, like maturity, like consideration, and so you absorb them. And you get very good at the small adjustments, at reading a room and understanding, before you have said anything, how much of yourself it is safe to bring. What you do not realize while this is happening is that you are losing something. Not just in the eyes of other people, though, that too, but in your own sense of who you are. Because a self that is never fully expressed is a self that becomes, over time, a little hard to locate. You know what you think, in theory, but you have not said it out loud, in full, without softening, in so long that you are no longer entirely sure you trust your own voice. Carol said, I went to a book group for 3 years and I never once said what I actually thought about any of the books. She said it simply, not with bitterness, just as a fact she had only recently understood. She said, I would read my thoughts. I would feel them strongly. And then I would say something like, well, I can see what they were going for. And everyone would agree, and I would drive home wondering why I felt so hollow. The second thing I want to say is about why it is so hard to stop. Because you would think, After the moment of clarity, after Carol asked herself, who am I doing this for, that the next step would be obvious. Speak up. Be direct. Stop apologizing. Simple, but it is not simple. And the reason is this. The behavior that cost Carol something real also gave her something real. It gave her a version of peace, a kind of smoothness in her relationships, the particular comfort of being easy to be around, of never being the cause of friction, of being, and this word matters, likable. When you have built an identity around being easy and warm and uncomplicated, the idea of becoming someone who says what she actually thinks feels not like liberation, but like loss, like becoming difficult, like becoming a problem, like becoming the kind of woman that other women talk about with a raised eyebrow. Carol said, I was terrified, not of anyone specific, just of being thought of differently, of becoming someone who was less easy to love. I understand that fear. Most women I have spoken to understand it, because the version of love we were taught, particularly those of us who grew up watching women make themselves smaller to keep the peace, is conditional on agreeableness, on not being difficult. And when you have built your sense of being loved on those conditions, removing the conditions feels like removing the floor. What she discovered slowly, with a great deal of stumbling, was that the women who mattered to her did not love her less when she became more herself. Some people moved away, yes. Some friendships grew quieter. But the ones that remained became something different, something with more actual substance. For the first time in many years, Carol felt known rather than merely liked. And she discovered something else, that she had underestimated the people around her. She had assumed that the real version of her would be too much, and in assuming that, she had been quietly insulting the people who loved her, suggesting they could only handle the edited version, never the full one. There was also something she had not expected about the grief. Because when she started to become more herself, when she stopped softening and editing and leaving rooms, she felt not only relief, but loss. Loss for the years. For the version of herself who had been in that book group for 3 years and never once said what she actually thought. For the conversations where she had known exactly what she wanted to say and had swallowed it back down before it reached her lips. That grief is real. It is allowed. And I think it is important to name it, because some women feel it and think it means they have made a mistake. It does not mean that. It means you are starting to understand what you were given and what you gave away. That understanding is the beginning of something, not the end. The third thing I want to say is about what taking up space actually looks like in practice when you begin. It does not look like becoming loud. It does not look like a grand declaration. For Carol, it looked like this. She started finishing her sentences. She stopped adding, but of course I might be wrong at the end of opinions, she held confidently. She stopped laughing at things she did not find funny. She stopped leaving rooms when she was tired to spare other people the sight of her being tired. Small things, embarrassingly small things, she said. And yet each one felt significant, because each one was a small act of staying, of saying, I am here and I am allowed to be here exactly as I am. She also started telling her daughter the truth, not harshly, not as a confrontation, but as an equal, as someone whose view of things was worth expressing and worth hearing. And her daughter, who had spent 30 years of her own life with a mother she loved but could not quite reach, said, Mom, I have been waiting for this. Carol cried when she told me that, not with sadness, with something harder to name. The feeling, she said, of arriving somewhere she had always been supposed to be. I want to say something to you directly. If this is landing, you are not too much. You have never been too much. You have simply been in rooms and in relationships and perhaps in a marriage where the full version of you was not invited, where you understood without being told that the edited version was more welcome, and you learned to offer that version instead, because you are a person who understands what makes things easier for others. That is not a flaw. That is a kind of intelligence. But it is an intelligence that was pointed in the wrong direction, and it is not too late to point it somewhere else. Start small. Finish a sentence you would normally leave half said. Hold an opinion through to the end without apologizing for it. See what happens when you are in a room as yourself. I have seen women do this in their 60s and 70s. It is never too late to become someone who knows how to be fully in a room. It is never too late to stop apologizing for taking up space that was always yours. Carol told me something recently. She said, "I do not recognize myself from 10 years ago." And she did not mean it sadly. She meant she had become someone she actually recognized, someone she could locate. Someone who, when she sat in a room and opened her mouth, said what was actually in her mind, and not the smoothed over version of it. She said, "I had no idea how exhausting it was to edit yourself constantly. I had been doing it for so long, I thought it was just how I was made. It is not how I was made. It is what I learned to do, and I unlearned it slowly, badly, imperfectly, but I unlearned it. That is enough. That is more than enough. That space was always yours." My name is Patricia Hayes. This is Patricia's Porch, where I believe the most honest conversations are the ones that change us. If this reached you today, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe below. I am here every week, and I would love to keep this conversation going with you. Thank you for sitting with me. I will see you next time.